want to, in particular, of course, thank my colleague, Deputy Mayor Michael Thompson, who has both been very involved in a number of these initiatives to support these community organizations, and of course has responsibility for the allocation of these grants in what I call pandemic wartime, but also in peacetime as well. This is a very positive and impactful announcement in our view. We have seen unprecedented coming together of people in the City of Toronto in unique partnerships over the course of the pandemic, with the view, of course, being to support people, especially the most vulnerable. And it really has indeed been through partnerships with community agencies across the city that we've been able to do this, and I think in a way that has been successful and effective and unprecedented. Many of the nonprofit organizations have stepped up to help us in our efforts responding to the pandemic, and they, of course, for many years have recognized and been helping us to deal with what is a very real need out there. The work that these agencies do on a day in and day out basis in peacetime, as I call it, has helped us to serve vulnerable residents across the city, and has particularly helped us to do that during the course of the pandemic. I believe that while we have much to do, and while we have not achieved a complete resolution to any of the many challenges that have faced us during the pandemic, we have come a long way, and we have a record to be proud of, and one that I think stands us in the very top ranks of cities in North America or around the world in terms of what we've been able to do. And so that means that investing in the community sector is relevant and needed now more than ever. And, you know, notwithstanding the good news of this week, which is that the city is going to begin to reopen and we can get people back to work and businesses open again and so on, there are still, of course, many people out there who need help and who will continue to need help. So to assist those vulnerable populations in particular, we are announcing today that approximately $4.97 million from the TO Supports Investment Fund will be allocated towards community-based agencies who are supporting vulnerable residents that have been impacted upon by the COVID-19 pandemic. The TO Supports Investment Fund was created for the purpose of investing in partnerships with social service agencies to help support the urgent needs of Toronto's most vulnerable residents. The funding has been created from first a $2.81 million portion of the city's allocation of the Social Services Relief Fund from the province of Ontario, with the remainder of that money going to things like some of the specific relief we're providing to homeless populations. Secondly, an allocation of $370,000 from the Scheinberg Relief Fund through the Better Toronto Coalition Fund at the Toronto Foundation. And thirdly, a $1.79 million donation from the Canadian Medical Association Foundation for the COVID-19 Community Response Fund, which was created to help vulnerable populations in collaboration with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. All of this means that we can reach even more people across the city. The funding will be invested in community-based agencies that are partnering with us on citywide solutions in the following 8 priority areas: housing and homelessness, food access and security, family support, mental health support, income support, social connection, community sector support, and community safety and well-being. All of these present themselves, of course, as key supports and services that all residents should have access to. From the start of the pandemic, we have worked hard to address gaps that we find in the social support and services system. Through our City Community Response Table and the Community Coordination Plan, we have so far delivered critical services, including the following: the Red Cross Food Hamper Program, for example, which has helped to meet the food access needs of seniors and those in isolation or are subject to quarantine, and thousands of food hampers have been delivered through that program. Emergency food access to provide prepared and delivered meals, food hampers, pop-up enhanced food banks, food and restaurant and grocery store vouchers to, again, vulnerable, isolated and marginalized populations. And 5 community kitchens. Since March, we've been collecting requests and having discussions with the agencies to hear more about what they need right away in order to provide for their particular client groups. And based on these discussions, starting this week, funds will be released to more than 50 community-based agencies so that they can continue providing support to vulnerable communities through important supports and services. And those include the following: mental health support through enhanced phone support. And we've had, again, a concerning but nonetheless a justifying demand through the 211 service that we've offered, with the participation of many of the different community organizations, some of whom will receive support today. distributing culturally appropriate prepared meals and food hampers, baby food, traditional medicines, air conditioners, providing hygiene kits, putting in Wi-Fi hotspots, and more. I am proud of the fact that these funds will back up a commitment that the City of Toronto made from the beginning, namely to deliver support in real partnership with organizations who know the communities they serve best. So we have, for example, Black community, LGBTQ2S+ organizations, Indigenous organizations, and Asian organizations, just to name a few, who are helping us to deliver food security, mental health supports, and things like that to people they know best. And they know not just the people, but they know their unique needs for support. And I believe this has allowed us to serve these communities more sensitively and more effectively during this emergency, as we will continue to do. These funds are not intended to meet long-term recovery needs. We know that we need to act now during the course of the pandemic, which, notwithstanding the phasing of the reopening, continues, and we're confident that this funding and these partnerships will help to address the immediate needs of vulnerable people in our city, or at least help to do so. However, in both the short and the longer term, we cannot continue to do this alone. And by that, I don't mean by doing it alone, we, in this case, includes those agencies and private donors and the city. We cannot continue to do these things alone, even with the provincial help we're acknowledging and expressing our gratitude for today. I do acknowledge with gratitude the emergency financial contribution from the province, and that forms an important part of today's announcement, as I said. I have felt compelled, and will continue to do so, to call on the other levels of government to help provide more substantial funding for our city and other cities and towns across the province with these kinds of needs in the wake of the pandemic, because that pandemic, the COVID-19, has had severe consequences on our finances, both in terms of increased costs of looking after especially most vulnerable people, but looking after all people, and revenue shortfalls that we've experienced because, for example, people are not using the public transit. And that affects our ability in the present and in the future to continue to look after vulnerable people in our city. I think people understand that. We as a city have been totally committed to doing what we can with the help of the federal and provincial governments during this unprecedented time, and to setting a very high standard for the caring for our most vulnerable populations during the emergency period. It has been my #1 focus, alongside the preservation of life, the maintenance of essential services. This has been to look after, in an effective, sensitive way, our most vulnerable populations during the pandemic. My job, and the job of my colleagues, including Deputy Mayor Thompson, is to protect the health and safety of our residents and ensure that as we start to reopen, no one is left behind. And we have done this successfully through collaboration with other partners, and that is what this announcement is all about. It has proven to be successful thus far, and I am confident that the work being done here now and the funding that we're providing here today will help us make a bigger and more positive impact in the lives of many who need that support going forward. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in helping us to respond so far to the needs of our most vulnerable residents. I want to thank the Province of Ontario, the Canadian Medical Association Foundation, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and the Scheinberg Relief Fund for their contribution to the Supports TO Investment Fund. And I want to thank all of these agencies. They are agencies that are often unsung. I know from my days supporting and raising money for the United Way before I was mayor that these are the small agencies that often don't have the kind of fundraising capacity they would need to provide the help that they do to the number of people that they do, often in the most marginalized communities that are, in some respects, out of sight in terms of some of their very acute needs. The work that is being done through these agencies and with the help of this funding is making a difference in the lives of many, many people. It is making sure that people are getting through this pandemic, because while we've all been using the expression, we will get through this together, there are some people who undoubtedly have much bigger challenges and obstacles in front of them in terms of getting through the pandemic than others. It is addressing some of the very unique needs of our Black, our Asian, our Indigenous, and our LGBTQ2S+ communities, some of which have been among the hardest hit by the pandemic itself, in part due to socioeconomic inequity, which must be continued to be at the top of our agenda of things to address going forward. And that will be a big challenge in front of us as we reach the end of the pandemic wartime period, as I call it. The challenge will be that we can deliver more effective, more targeted help to marginalized communities through unique partnerships, including government, including the nonprofit organizations I've made reference to, and including private sector donations. And the challenge in front of us is going to be, how do we keep those partnerships going when we return to peacetime, to more normal times? So that is something that is in front of us. We are working hard to achieve it, and today is another positive step in the right direction of supporting these partnerships. And I would now like to call on my colleague, Deputy Mayor Michael Thompson, who's been very committed to this program in particular and to all the programs we operate year in and year out to support these organizations who in turn support people. So I would ask him to come and say a few words.
Thank you very much, Mayor Tory, and good morning, everyone. There is no question that the last 3 months has been a challenging time for all Torontonians. It has been an extremely difficult period for our most vulnerable residents. Even before the pandemic, they faced difficulties getting adequate food and housing, finding stable jobs, and obtaining social and mental health support for their families. Since the pandemic was declared in March, the city has made protecting their well-being a top priority. From the beginning, city staff has collaborated closely with community-based agencies to identify the most urgent needs and has worked with our partners to move quickly to meet those needs. This joint effort has led to the establishment of the food hamper program the mayor's mentioned, a temporary food bank, pop-up food banks, and the distribution of grocery gift cards to Toronto students and their families. Collaboration has also enabled us to implement our mental health support strategy to help connect residents to free mental health services during the pandemic. Our partnership with community-based agencies is essential to the success of these initiatives, and we've committed to continue supporting these organizations as they provide valuable services to residents through this difficult period. The $4.97 million in additional funding we have announced today will help these agencies carry out their vital work through the next stage of recovery. I'd like to thank all of our community partners for the work that they have done over the past months and the work that they will continue to do until the pandemic is over.
Thank you, Michael, and Lavin will help us to go through any questions you may have.
Okay, thanks everyone. Just a reminder, it's one question, one follow-up. We'll now open the floor. It's Jennifer Pagliaro from the Toronto Star. You're up.
Morning, Mayor. I wanted to know how the agencies will be selected, or have they already been selected, and how is the city choosing which neighborhoods to target? Is it based on public health data or some other measure?
So there were two decisions that had to be made here. There was a lump sum of money given by the province of Ontario principally, although added to by the other organizations I've mentioned, and we had to decide on the division of that as between money that went out to what I'll call third-party community organizations and the money that went to help support some of our efforts with respect to homelessness and so on. City staff entirely made the decisions with respect to the organizations based on their expressions of interest and need, and it's a long list. I think it is in excess of 50 organizations. They are right across the city. Some serve citywide purposes. Others, I think I saw one for a boys and girls club that's in the east part of the city. So I think they cover a range, a very wide range of organizations that have been delivering vital social services in some of the areas we mentioned, but not confined to those: food, mental health, housing, and so on. So it was done by our city staff based on their assessment, and the numbers are smaller in some cases and much larger in others, depending on the breadth of service being provided by those organizations.
And how is the funding distributed? Is it evenly across organizations, or is there a needs assessment?
No, there's, I mean, I have the list right here, and I gather these organizations have now been informed of what they're getting, but it ranges from, you know, modest grants. I see on this first page, for example, one for $10,000, on the very same page, one for $327,000. The $327,000, I hope they all know this by now because they're soon going to, is for the East Scarborough Boys and Girls Club, whereas the $10,000 one is for something that is helping people with mental health conditions and vulnerable seniors citywide. So it again is based on assessments of needs that were put forward by these organizations, and I think from my eyeballing of the list, it looks to be spread through the city, but obviously where the people are providing the services, because by nature these organizations serve the more vulnerable people, the focus of the actual clients served is more vulnerable people.
And I think Jennifer has a follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one more question, not totally on this topic, but and council's coming up, and I know that there's been a lot of ongoing debate about the policing item that we're expecting. I know that you've had a lot to say about that, and the Toronto Police Board decided to postpone their discussion of those future strategies. I just wonder, given that we're seeing, almost weekly protests, ongoing demands for up to 50% reduction in the police budget, what is your plan on Monday and Tuesday when it comes to the police budget and those demands?
Well, first of all, I think most people will recognize the fact that policing is an area that is not simply within the domain of the city government or the provincial government, and in fact, it is not within the domain at all of the city council exclusively. Rather, there are divided responsibilities as between what the city does principally as a funder and what the police board has responsibility for under separate legislation. And so what we're aiming to do is to have a consensus, a series of initiatives brought forward that have us looking at some different ways of doing policing, and they would have some budgetary impacts going forward, although, as I've always said, I think the best way to proceed, the most prudent way, is to look at the reforms first and make sure you try to determine what the financial consequences are of bringing about that reform. So, for example, if you decided you were going to have mental health calls dealt with differently, other than by police in the vast majority of cases, which I support, then obviously that would have a financial consequence in that you would take money from the police budget and allocate it somewhere else where this service might be provided by a different group of people, mental health professionals. And so I think what people will find is that what will come forward to City Council next week will be a comprehensive set of different kinds of reforms, that being one example that we would be wanting to actively explore in terms of the feasibility and timing of making such a change. But in many cases, we've also put forward things, and Deputy Mayor Thompson has been involved in this, as have other members of council, quite a few members of council, making requests of the Police Services Board, because again, the City Council itself does not control those kinds of decisions. In other cases, we've had to make requests, or will through these resolutions, if passed, of the province to make other kinds of legislative changes to permit reforms to be made in policing. So it's a very complicated area, which is why I have felt very strongly, and have been not afraid to say so, that the way in which you go about dealing with it is in a careful, sensitive, planned way. And I think people will find that this resolution that comes forward is not just my work, but it's the work of a lot of people, including Deputy Mayor Thompson, and it will be a comprehensive, careful, sensitive way to try and draw a consensus of the council together, which I think makes us far stronger in terms of our ability to achieve reform than if we just, all moved our own motions and did our own thing.
Okay, that's it for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.